we go. Evening, everyone. Good evening. Got another good news one. I want to talk about public sector pay. There are a couple of other things in here. Obviously, bring those in later on. Someone asked a question that I've clipped, so hopefully I'll remember to come back to it. But if I don't, once we've sort of gone through this, feel free to bring it in. But actually, I'm just going to get rid of that. That's for later. I'm showing you graphs too early. So public sector pay is at last going to go back in the right direction. We've had the government laying the groundwork for this. Obviously, nothing official is going to be announced until the budget is announced. And the budget, you know, the Rachel Reeves' first budget statement will be, I presume, this September, but it'll be after summer. But the groundwork is being laid. We are, again, nothing's official, but it's been treated as, yeah, this is happening. So we're told to expect that various public sector pay review bodies are recommending up to 5.5% pay increases. Now, this is above the level of inflation. Now, I do have to point out a couple of things here. There are some things to bear in mind, which is why I've decided to do this as like a stream rather than just do a random video about it. I will do a video on it once it is all official, but that'll be like September or something. So there's different types of inflation. Whenever you see the headline inflation figures, that's usually CPI inflation. CPI inflation at the moment, I've actually got the ONS figures in front of me, except I've now lost it. 2%. So the CPI inflation, the latest CPI inflation is 2%, which is bang on target. The target for inflation is 2%. So a 5.5% pay increase sounds like 3.5% above the level of inflation, 3.5% in real terms. That is in the right direction, and that obviously needs to continue. That does not make up for like 15 years of effective pay cuts, although I'll show you the extent of that in a moment. However, in terms of the facts and figures I'm going to show you, which comes from the Institute for Fiscal Studies, who have got and again, this is the latest report. This is from this year, so it's based on everything up to and including last year's. Obviously, it can't do it based on 2024 because we're still in 2024, so it's up to 2023, and it has it uses CPIH, which is because CPI doesn't take into account housing costs. Now, if the cost of housing increases as a share of income over time, which it does, then CPI is not, even though I use it as a rough and ready method, because it's by far and away the easiest to use, it's not as good as using CPIH, which is why referring to Institute for Fiscal Studies reports is always the best way to go. And the CPIH figure at the moment, I've lost it again now, is 2.8%. So that's way lower than it used to be again. So however, although and that's what we sometimes, so the CPIH figure is higher than the CPI figure because housing costs have carried on increasing even in the last 12 months as a share of incomes. These pay rises would still be above inflation. Now, it is worth bearing in mind when you read this figure of 5.5%, that doesn't mean to say every public sector worker is on for a 5.5% pay rise. It's certain ones, and usually the way these things work is people, which is a good thing, on the lower end of the scale will tend to get a larger increase than those at the upper end of the scale. In a cost of living crisis, that's important because it's the ones at the lower end of the scale who are struggling the most, even though everyone deserves not to have real terms pay cuts regardless of their income, as long as they're doing the same work. But there you go. Your dad's still annoyed about the pay increases. What? Because they've been too low, because they're now going to get higher. Have I heard anything about civil servants? Teachers, nurses, doctors get all the attention. Civil servants were treated even worse than them. Well, let's start to go through some. But you are right. The poster boys are always going to be teachers, nurses, doctors, but that's because members of the public appreciate them most. But I will also just point out before I start putting the old facts and figures up that Rachel Reeves has made, and she's been laying the groundwork in two ways from both ends. Because here's the thing, to afford these pay increases, the government have to find new money. Well, that's these tax rises that the Tories are whining about. But bear in mind, Labour have said no increase to income tax, VAT or national insurance, and the ordinary workers, and they've defined that as people on low to middle incomes, will not be seeing their taxes go up either. And even if you are on significantly more than that, I would just say this. The, like, even, let's say you're on like 100 grand a year, doesn't mean you're getting taxed more either, because they've ruled out increases to taxes on income tax, VAT and national insurance. And because they've said the tax burden won't go up for people on low to middle incomes, unless you're paying a tax that doesn't apply to people on low to middle incomes, like say capital gains tax or VAT on private school fees, which we already know has been added anyway, so that's not a new tax, then you're still fine. So when the Tory or the Tory press try and go, oh, they're going to raise your tax, it's like, no, they're really not. They're really not. We are going to be, you know, however Rachel Reeves does it, and we obviously won't know that until she announces it, it's going to be taxing the rich because, you know, because of what they've already committed to. But anyway, let's start to go through. So, first of all, this is the story of what's been happening in terms of public sector pay and private sector pay. Now, actually, before I just want to point out, it's done this in several blocks. So we've got 2007 to 2010. What is that period about? That is the period when Labour were in government, but dealing with an economic crisis, the banking crisis at that case. Because in terms of what I'm going to show you, it might appear to someone who wants to be charitable to the Tories, oh, they were getting things better and then COVID hit. Oh, that's bad luck. Here is Labour showing what happened with the banking crash. They maintained public sector pay, and this is in real terms. All of these figures that I've put here are real terms. The Institute for Fiscal Studies, they're not like these idiots in the Express who just don't seem to take account of inflation. They do take account of inflation, and they use CPIH inflation. That takes account of housing costs as well. I'm not sure that it fully takes account of all. It tries to anyway. So 2007 to 2010, public sector pay went up 1.4%. That's a bit crap over 3 years. But you know what? We had a huge economic crash. Private sector pay went down. So what's happened here is the government protected public sector in real terms. So remember, public sector pay was going up, but in real terms was, you know, okay, 1.4%. But it was being maintained, whereas private sector pay was going down. Then you had 2010 to 2019. So this is the period of calm. This is when the Tories had no economic crisis to deal with, because the banking crisis, Labour had dealt with it. So all they had to do was carry on recovering. And up to 2019, so that's before Brexit and before COVID, right? Public sector pay down 2%, but private sector pay up 2.4%. So the private sector thought that things were going well enough. Again, I would still say over 9 years, 2.4% in real terms is a bit crap, but it is still up. It's up on the deal. The private sector obviously felt things were going well enough that in order to recruit and retain decent staff, they had to increase pay. In the same time, it's the same economic conditions. The Tories reduced public sector pay. And then they've broken that down further. So you can see where the real damage is. 2010 to 2015 is where the damage was done. That's their austerity. That's their main. I mean, I know in some ways austerity never seemed to go away, but that was their main austerity years. Whereas when they sort of, ironically after the coalition years, they sort of released their foot off the throat of public sector workers and it went up a little bit. I mean, look at this. It went up 1.4% between 2015 and 2019. That's in 4 years. It went up by the same percentage as it went up under Labour in 3 years when they had an actual international economic crisis and recession. But private sector pay after this point, after 2015, just took off. So that was still going down during 2010 to 2015, but it took off after 2015, and this was not matched in the public sector. And then we can see COVID years, 2019 to 2023, private sector pay carried on going up, public sector pay back down again. So that's the reality there. We can see in terms of real pay increases, again, the CPIH used here, sorry, CPIH. So we can see what happened under Labour, because this goes right back to 2001. So public sector pay rose above the level of private sector pay. So average public sector pay was higher. That will have also been helping to raise private sector pay, because if the private sector want to be able to recruit and retain decent staff, they need to offer competitive salaries. If the public sector is offering competitive salaries, then that sort of boosts theirs as well, the importance of what the government does. And you can sort of see it carried on, even though, again, you can see this maintenance. I'm putting my cursor on. You can't see the cursor, I don't think. But you can see after the banking crisis, it levels out. The public sector one levels out. That is Labour maintaining it. At the same time, the private sector pay was going down. The government maintained public sector pay in real terms, right? The opposite happened sort of with COVID. What happened with COVID, you can see during the peak years, actually it rose a lot. It really did rise a lot. And that's because 2020 was that time the government going, oh, public sector workers, marvellous, heroes, clap, 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 clap. And they found it very difficult to not give them, decent pay increases relative to inflation. But then it immediately crashed. As soon as the press got bored with COVID and all of a sudden these public sector workers weren't heroes anymore, look at it crash. And look where it crashed to. It has since risen. I'll come to that in a moment. Look where it crashed to. It crashed below this dotted line, which if we trace it back, goes back to 2004, basically. So the Tories, their reward for public sector workers, as soon as the press got bored with COVID, because it hasn't actually gone away, as soon as they got bored with COVID, they allowed public sector pay in real terms. Remember, this is real terms. This is taking inflation into account. Allowed it to crash back to 2004 levels. Derek's there saying CPIH takes account of only owner-occupiers' costs, not renters. So yes and no. It does take account of some rents, which is why I say about the housing costs it's not ideal. It does take account of some rents, but not all. But at the same time, it is still taking account of housing costs, which is better than CPI, which takes no account of housing costs. So in terms of, no system of measuring inflation is going to be perfect because it's never going to match every individual. But CPIH is the best one that realistically we have. Because gathering data on rents is incredibly fiendishly difficult. In fact, there have been issues with it in the past. The Office for National Statistics at one point stopped using it because it was the data was so dodgy. So yeah, it is right to say it doesn't, but it's not just owner occupied. It does include some other rents as well. But as I say, it is the best system. And then, of course, what's happened since this crash as well, we've had for the first time since the start of this graph, public sector pay has fallen behind private sector pay. So you have so no wonder we have a recruitment problem in the public sector. And one of the things Rachel Reeves has said in terms of, yes, the finances are tight, and yeah, it might sound like above inflation pay might sound fiscally strange, but she's explained that there's a cost to not, providing the pay that the public review bodies suggest. In fact, she said two things about that. First of all, there's obviously the cost of strikes. The government had to admit itself that the cost of prolonged strikes was greater than just settling in the first place for what they wanted, or for what they would have accepted. I mean, obviously, everyone knows what a union says it wants is its starting position, right? But the other cost is retention and recruitment. If you're not offering decent pay, you cannot recruit. Labour have said they want to recruit 6,500 extra teachers. That will be specifically for England because that's sort of devolved. They want to recruit. They need to recruit more people into the NHS. They could do with recruiting some decent coppers, because the police are having an absolute nightmare, particularly in London, but in quite a lot of parts of the country. It wasn't helped by having massive cuts to the police force under the Tories. And then when they tried to sort of reinstate them, it was a bit like, oh, we can't actually recruit 20,000 in like a couple of months. What we're going to do? I know, just let anyone in. So we could do with recruiting some coppers that aren't thick or criminal or on drugs or something. Which brings me to the next thing. So where's that? I've already done that. And this is where the retention and recruitment comes into it. So you'll notice this is from 2007. This is using, some of these use a base of 2010 when the Tories took over. Some of it uses 2007 because that's the start of the banking crisis. We sort of talk about it really hitting in 2008, but 2007 is where it's got its roots. And you can always see the 25th percentile. So that's like everyone up the sort of lowest paid 25%. They've actually had increases because even the Tories understand that they cannot allow staff shortages to completely dominate. Otherwise, there is no service at all. And they understand some basics of market forces. So you will often find those on the lowest incomes will tend to get some sort of increase. The median is only now just above where it was in 2007. But it is still below where it was in 2010. And then people on the upper end of the scale have just been completely shafted. Absolutely shafted. Theirs has gone below by quite a bit as well. I'll go through a couple of comments because the next thing I want to show is really quite eye-opening for some people. Derek's saying the cut in national insurance contributions for those earning more than 50,000 should go. They're not average earners. So I would agree, other than to say there was absolutely nothing Labour could do about that. When the Tories cut national insurance this year, Labour would not have done that. Labour did not support that. But as soon as they did it, Labour had to basically commit. Because the problem is the national insurance cut provided an instant boost to income. Now, sure, that boost to income has been wiped out by various other cost increases, right? But all of the things that Labour are doing right now to reduce the cost of living are not going to be instant. So if Labour reinstated those national insurance contributions, then what would happen is they would instantly be taking money from, as people would see it, from their pay packets, and they wouldn't be compensating with lower energy bills, housing costs, transport costs, anything. Because all of those things will take some years. So until Labour can show the lowering, in real terms, the lowering cost of living, they can't really start, because that would be basically taxing even people on 50,000, it is significantly above the median. But yeah, so politically, I can understand why they've had to say that. It's just a standard thing. And it does tie their hands a little bit, but it is only a little. And it is a bit because the national insurance contribution cuts are a significant chunk of this fiscal black hole that Rachel Reeves is talking about at the moment. If the Tories hadn't done that, then, in fact, it's actually I actually find it amusing because Rachel Reeves can say, as soon as Jeremy Hunt stands up and wags his finger at her, she can just stand up and say, well, if you hadn't dropped national insurance, this hole wouldn't be nearly as big. It's like you have basically forced me to raise, let's say she raises capital gains tax. Yeah, let's say that's what she does. You forced me to raise capital gains tax because you didn't want it to be paid for with national insurance. She can just stand up, say that, and sit down again. Really easy. Someone's saying here, the ASLEF action in Scotland seems to be partly politically motivated, given the train drivers in Scotland are already paid more than the rest of the UK. No. That doesn't matter. Obviously, yeah, there are some people in unions who are very, very political and biased and all the rest of it, sure. But the job of a union is to try and get the best pay and conditions it can for its members. That's its job. It's there literally to lobby for the best. It's a union. Any lobby group's not interested in what's fair. What's fair is subjective. They're interested in getting the best deal they can get. ASLEF members pay their membership fee to their union so that they do this. It's an investment. We pay you our membership fees. You get us the best pay and conditions you can. So no, I don't accept that at all. It's the job of a union to get the best deal it can. If it ends up with a better deal than someone else, well, that's down to their good negotiating hand or the weakness of whoever they were up against. Big on there saying, ex-police officer and recruiter here, we have only had boost for recruitment following boost to pay. Well, I mean, again, you'd think this is something the Tories understand. Well, everyone understands it. It's market forces. Ultimately, there are people who are lucky and they do a job that they would do for way less. Like I am in that fortunate position. I would even say as a teacher, although I couldn't have done it for way less, but I did, you know, where I lived and my particular circumstances, because I'm not someone who used to buy new cars or go on holiday or anything like that. So my teacher's pay, like in the early days, don't get me wrong, when I was a young teacher, but then when I was a young teacher, because Labour were boosting it a lot, it didn't seem that bad. But, you know, but when I was before I started doing this job full time and I was a teacher, I was more than happy with my pay, even though I was aware that my pay had fallen a lot in real terms. But in turn, you know, I'm not motivated by money as long as I've got enough, as long as I feel secure with what I've got. And it was fine for me. I had everything I needed and what I wanted. I could get what I wanted, really. So yeah, I was quite happy on my teacher's pay, but it's but for most people there is one reason why they do that job, and that is for the money. And so of course money is the prime motivator for it. You know, I think it's nice to have a job where you're also, because I used to say, you know, when I wanted to become a teacher, like my parents, it was like, well, why do you want to become a teacher? It's like crap money. And my attitude was, what is the point? Like, I'm about to embark on a career that's going to occupy about 50 years of my life, right? What is the point of doing a job for 40 to 50 years? Because obviously some people can retire earlier than others. 40 to 50 years that you hate. That's like half your life. Why would you spend half your life doing something you hate just so that you can retire a bit early when you're old and knackered anyway? Why not do a job you like for less money and be happy about it? Spend half your life happy. So that was my attitude. Not that I was always entirely happy as a teacher. There were triumphs and disasters aplenty, as Kipling would have noted. But most people, yeah. You know, you get that question in the interview. It's always a stupid, bloody question. Why do you want this job? And if everyone was to be perfectly honest, they would say, because I've got a bit of an aversion to starving to death. So of course pay is the number one way you recruit people. And that is why this 25th percentile is the highest. The median is next, although it's, I mean, you know, and then the 75th and 90th percentiles are way down there. And it's all in order because it's all about recruitment and retention in those early few years. Because the idea is, once someone has embarked on a career path for say 5 or 10 years, it's like, well, they're trapped now, aren't they? They're not completely trapped. It is possible to move. But once you've got 10 years experience in a particular career, it's really hard to move to a different career without taking a pay cut before you bring it back up again. And most people won't do that. Once they're in the 30s, most people won't do that. So that's why, even under the Tories, and it'll happen under Labour as well, you know, because recruitment and retention is such a powerful thing. But there we go. Right. Let's have a look now at the next one. Types of worker, because someone was asking about this earlier. Types of worker now. So you will notice it doesn't have like general civil servants on here, I'm afraid, because it is the most notable one. So what we've got here, this is the baseline for this is April 2010, by the way. So this is just before the Tories. It's the tax year when the Tories took over the month after. So we can see educational assistance increased. Again, very low paid workers. Very low. Those on the lowest incomes have had real terms increases under the Tories. Obviously, it's not been enough because this is pathetic, just under 10% after 13 years. Because that's what this is, 2010 to 2023, 13 years is rubbish. And yet, it shows a small increase in the private sector pay. Public sector pay overall down. But even worse than that, and when you say what about civil servants, if you look at nurses, teachers, doctors, completely screwed. Look at this. And that teachers, that upward thing there, because it's the dotted line, that's a projected increase. You know, you just look at this. So the three of the most, like the ones that the public get behind, nurses, teachers and doctors, have actually all received significantly below public sector averages. And it shows you some figures here. This is in real terms. So when it says public sector, excluding financial services, because, you know, that's a different thing. Public sector, and this is real terms. So April 2010, 33,632. They didn't get paid that on average. That's in 2023 money. But now it's 31,932. So it went down for April because it's not just COVID. It was lower in April 2019 and then it got lower still for April 2023. So the pay in real terms has gone down over these 13 years. And you could look at it and go, it's only gone down a bit. But it's like, it shouldn't have gone down at all. It should have gone up. It should have gone up. You know, if I'm just going to get rid of this, I'm just going to put this back up. Look what happened under Labour. Look what happened. There was a downy bit where the financial crash happened, then straight back up again and maintained. So over the overall period, there was actually a slight increase in public sector pay, even taking that initial wallop of the banking crisis and everything going mental. And then it only went down under the Tories. And then it started to come up again towards the end. And then, you know, but then after they got bored with COVID, they crashed it properly back down again. So, you know, what's happening here is it should have gone up. No reason. They had 9 years of comfortable economic conditions. 9 years where nothing happened in the world to really hurt it. James Humphreys, when I did my BTEC National Diploma in Business, I was told, money moves you, it doesn't motivate you. I think it motivates a lot of people. That's the essence of capitalism, isn't it? And that's why, you know, I sort of accept capitalism will be a thing. I just say it needs to be very highly regulated because people are naturally capitalist. And, you know, like, I mean, there are people who are motivated more or less strongly by money. There are people who aren't motivated at all. There are people who go and live in the wild. They'll build a log cabin and happily just live off the land. They're not motivated by money at all. But by and large, people are, and it's not the money itself, of course. Like I don't give a rat's ass about money. For me, it's like it's the comfort. It's like the security net. So I would like to win the lottery, not because I want to go out on the town every night. I don't. I hate the idea. I want to like just be secure. But there we go. Louise just saying there, my husband and I don't drink or smoke or have holidays or go out to eat. We barely got through this month. We're on disability benefits, really struggling. I mean, this is, this is the thing as well. When you talk about like, so if I go back, hold on, because that's relevant to this. if I go back to this and we say, you know, those up to the 25th, remember that's only up to the 25th percentile. There's a huge difference between the 10th percentile and the 25th, and that's not on here. But, you know, we talk about, these are percentage increases, but like a 15%, okay, this is like more like 16%. A 16% increase for the 25th percentile is worth less in money terms. Remember, this is still in real terms, I will just point out, but it's still less in money terms than someone on the 90th percentile who's got, but I mean, that's a reduction, but this person on the 90th percentile still has way more money coming in than someone on the 25th percentile. So it's not, I'm not looking at this and saying those on the 25th percentile got a good deal. It's simply that theirs went up in real terms. But if your own I mean, first of all, 25th percentile is still quite high compared to those on the lowest incomes, because you know you might look at this and say what's the 10th, but also like if you're in the like the bottom first or second or even third decile, everything that comes into your household goes out, everything, which means if you're just about managing, then, but if anything happens, if any little emergency comes up, because I'll tell you what doesn't get included too much, there is a little bit of it in CPIH or CPI. What doesn't come up is like a major emergency cost, like your boiler blowing up, it's not insured or something like that. M saying there, Ori, you're saying, what's the point in doing something you hate for half your life just to earn money? Completely agree. If I don't like what I'm doing, it's completely boring. Well, it can be worse than that. People can have jobs they actually hate, where it's actually negatively impacting their mental health, which is why I had to add the caveat in about teaching, because sometimes that was not good for my mental health. But when I started wanting to be a teacher, it seemed like a good idea at the time. Sadly, Labour have ruled out employing nurses and doctors from abroad. No, they haven't. They've talked about wanting to have more domestically produced doctors and nurses. That's true. They're playing the game on the old immigration rhetoric. However, we don't have enough nurses and doctors being trained. So for Labour to turn that around, what's going to have to happen? It's going to take a couple of years, at least, and that's if they've got a real plan to do it. I assume they do. It's going to take a couple of years at least to really boost the numbers for training places. Then it takes more years to actually get them trained. Then when they're fully trained, and obviously it takes a doctor longer than a nurse, but it takes both of them several years, then they're newly qualified. They're qualified, they can do a job, but they're not experienced. So then it takes even more years to get experienced, right? I mean, how long do you think it takes to get, say, a consultant surgeon? That's a lot of years. That's a lot of years. So, but even for a nurse, whatever Labour do now, this moment, to try and get more domestically trained nurses, they're not going to get them until the next Parliament. So the simple fact of the matter, Labour haven't ruled anything like that out at all, nor have they said, and whenever they're asked directly, they refuse to say so. They are not talking about any cap on immigration either. They're not saying, oh, that it should be limited. They're saying it should be reduced. But given that the figures they're going by are record high levels of immigration, it can easily be reduced and be fine. Don't worry about it. So they're just playing a rhetoric game there. They certainly haven't ruled it out. And I'll tell you something else. They will absolutely be recruiting from abroad, because that is the only way to get the staff in. Because it's all right saying, oh, we should have more people trained in this country. I totally agree, by the way. You know, if you can boost the pay and conditions for jobs like nursing and medicine, paramedics, midwives, the whole caboodle, could be a brilliant career, very rewarding career. You ain't going to get them for years. And you're not going to get them, you're not going to get senior ones for decades. It's like, you know, you're talking 20 years to get a consultant. This is not, and that's, no, you know, that's like, that's not happening. You know, that cannot, so you need it really quickly. So I wouldn't pay too much attention to any little rhetoric like that. Where was I? Was I back on this one? Yeah. So let's see how else they've buggered up. So public sector, excluding financial services, gets paid less in real terms as of last April. Remember, obviously, we can't have this year's figures because we're still in this year, than they were in 2010. Nurses down a lot. Look at that. Nearly $5,000 lower. Doctors, basically, what's that? 16 grand lower? Well, 15 and a bit, 15 and a half grand lower. Teachers, six grand lower. Educational assistants, a bit extra, but again, look at the percentage thing. So that's only working out at about $1.5 grand more. $1.5 grand more in 13 years. The pay has gone up. So although the percentage looks really good, it's like, oh, they did all right, have I? It's worth $1.5 grand extra a year after 13 years. Absolutely rubbish. And they got, and then in the private sector, it's hardly moved at all, but it has ticked a little bit upwards. It's not even £1,000 extra. But that is, again, down to a few things, not the least of which is the Tories have crushed the economy. So they've prevented businesses being able to flourish, but also giving businesses who obviously focus on profits, private businesses, their focus is profit. I mean, that's just the nature of the beast. And because they've made working in the public sector so much less attractive, it helps the private sector suppress their own wages. Absolute nonsense. Jamie Mack saying, I grew up watching my dad absolutely detest going into his job every day. Swore I'd never get into that situation. Luckily going so far. And and a certain amount of it is, look, I mean, you can consciously make the decision when you're young that you want to prioritize, because I did. I mean, at the time when I was a teenager, I absolutely looked at it and I thought, look, you're in this job for a long time. Why would you do something you hate? It would be better, because like when the people talk about so you can retire early, earn lots of money so you can retire early, and my attitude was, well, if you do something you enjoy, why do you want to retire early? Why do you want? What are you going to do? What are you going to do when you retire early? You're going to do things you want to do. Well, why not do things you want to do for your whole life? That was my attitude. Rightly or wrongly, that was my attitude. And, I've had regrets, don't get me wrong. But at this particular point in my life, I don't. I am pleased with that decision. But we will see. My family was very poor, but not as bad as the Yorkshireman as done by Monty Python. Well, the Yorkshireman as done by Monty Python were all right because they were all rich. That was the point, wasn't it? They were just sort of discussing how it was when they were young and probably embellishing it a little bit. And Derek's saying there, my mate earns less than a new graduate because their pay has hardly increased for about 20 years. The problem is for a lot of people, and this is what the Tories just, it's like they still don't quite come to terms with this fact. Why support, like even Tom Tugendhat, who seems to be trying to at least say, look, we've lost faith in the party, but they're still framing it. They're still framing it in terms of what do you call it? Like their pitch to the public over the last few years. They're not actually acknowledging that for 14 years they completely strangled off their supply of new voters. They don't seem, I don't know whether behind closed doors they are, but in public, they're really not facing up to the fact that someone who was in their mid-20s under Labour is now worse off financially, or many people, I'm not saying everyone, but there are millions of people, I don't know how many millions of people would have been in their mid-20s, but there are a lot of people who were in their mid-20s when the government changed last time, who are now late 30s, 40-ish, who are in a worse financial position. And that's not supposed to happen. You expect to struggle in your 20s. You expect to struggle. You expect to start to sort of tread water a bit by the time you get to the end of your 20s into your 30s. Obviously, some people never do, but a lot of people start to sort of get ahead of the game a bit. And then by the time you get into 40, you're starting to get a bit more comfortable. You know, you're into a bit of a pattern of life. If you've got a mortgage, you know, that those mortgage repayments are now much lower than equivalent rents, which was not necessarily the case when you took that mortgage out. You know, you're on top of things. You've had your kids. The kids are still growing up. They're still costing you. But, you know, your career's gone on. You're in a better position in your 40s. And you're also looking ahead to the next 10 years. You've got that hope in you that in the next 10 years, the mortgage is paid off. Your kids have pissed off her. You know, they've pissed off somewhere else. They've gone and got their own lives. And you're actually looking quite pretty financially. Whereas now this same 40-year-old is still renting because they couldn't get a mortgage. So they're still renting. And those who can get a mortgage have just been hit with, and, you know, you could argue that the interest rates are not ridiculous, but given that they were basically zero for so many years, they've been hit with this massive increase at the same time as everything else, every other bill has gone up, and their own pay has been lowered in real terms. And they're looking at their kids and thinking, these are never buggering off. They're going to be 40 before they leave home. So you have nothing. But there we go. Uncle Sasha saying there, my wife and I worked really hard through our 30s and 40s, now on verge of retirement, feeling quite comfortable. I mean, yeah, I mean, some are and some aren't, but there's an increasing number approaching middle age now who are worse off than in their 20s, which is a mad situation if you're a conservative. It's like, I don't understand how they could be so stupid, because that shows a fundamental misunderstanding. It's like if we look at housing, so just take housing into account for a moment. So the Tories' main problem, and they are sort of aware of this, they haven't quite grasped the whole thing yet. They know that homeowners are their source of voters. They get a disproportionate number of their voters from homeowners, right? Not renters, homeowners, because they're on the side of the landlord. So renters don't tend to do very well under a Tory government. Homeowners can do. And yet they didn't build enough housing, which then made it... They didn't build enough housing at the same time as they were crushing people's pay, consciously reducing people's pay, which meant that housing costs went up, pay in real terms came down. So housing costs as a proportion of income, which also did go up under Labour, I am going to have to point out, but it went up under the Conservatives to a much greater extent. And that has like meant that they've crushed up. And the reason they got trapped into this is because their thought process, and George Osborne apparently said this to the Lib Dems at the time, their thought process was basically like this: yes, we need homeowners, but if we build houses, we piss off the ones who are homeowners now. And the way it'll have worked, even though I don't know George Osborne articulated it exactly in this detail, but I'll say it now. The way it works is this. So let's say the Conservatives build a load of homes, right? They piss off the NIMBYists, who are already homeowners, so they might lose their vote at the next election. However, people will move into those new homes and they will appreciate the fact that they could get on the housing ladder. And at some point in the future, some of those people will vote Conservative. But that some point in the future is probably 15 or 20 years later. Well, that's not in time for the next election, or even the one after. Now, I'll tell you where Labour have an advantage here. So Labour are also going to come up against NIMBYism. However, and you know, remember, Labour have now got a significant number of new MPs in NIMBY areas who are going to cause a bit of trouble, but it won't be enough. But Keir Starmer's still going to have to manage that process in terms of the discipline. But Labour have a big advantage over the Tories, and it is this. So let's say you've got this area and there's NIMBYs with their placards going, no new houses, and Labour build them anyway, right? Who's going to move into those houses? Because Labour are also saying first dibs on new builds, they have to legislate for this, but one of their policies is first-time buyers get first refusal on new houses. One thing that Labour says, too many new housing estates are just bought up by, you know, investment groups. They just buy the whole lot and then sell them on at a profit. So Labour is saying, no. First-time buyers. If you can't find a first-time buyer to buy the house, okay, whatever. But first-time buyers get first dibs on buying a house. So in other words, you've got to offer these houses up for sale. If a first-time buyer wants it, they can. That's it. They can have it. They can pay the money. They can have it. So what's going to happen is with new builds over the course of this Parliament, you're going to get mostly younger people moving into them. They may not be that young because obviously the housing situation is still as it is and it's still difficult to save up the deposit needed. But younger people, 20s and 30s, right? They are going to disproportionately vote Labour at the following election. So for the Conservatives, letting a load of people get onto the housing ladder, they're like growing those voters for decades down the line, 2 or 3 decades down the line. Labour get them immediately. So if Labour look at an area and there's like NIMBY opposition and a Labour MP is a bit worried about their majority, it's a bit like, yeah, but if you build the houses, you're going to get a sudden influx of people who will naturally vote Labour. So Labour have a big advantage on the housing thing in the short term that the Tories never did. But there we go. Actually, someone just said there's obviously a conversation going on that I've missed. I've gone to it. It says, I've been told by my parents as well as other people the things I really love doing, writing, music, painting, are hobbies. It's a hobby if you don't get paid for it. So this used to be a hobby for me when I didn't get paid for it. And then I got paid for it. And all of a sudden, it's not a hobby. It's really that simple. A hobby is something you enjoy doing. And I say you enjoy doing it. Some people seem to have hobbies they hate. You know, all those people who kept moaning about the England football team whilst watching the England football team. I just kept saying, why do you watch football? It obviously gives you such pain. Why do you do it? But most people choose hobbies they enjoy. But if you get paid for it, it's not a hobby anymore, is it? You may enjoy doing it, which is good. It's always nice to get paid for something you enjoy, but, you know, it's not a hobby. But someone else had just said, sorry, I missed it. I've lost it now. Oh, yeah, Derek, hard to make a living from the arts, but life is boring without them. Well, indeed, if you can't turn this into a living, hopefully you can do a job. But YouTube, I mean, social media is a really good way to turn artwork into, into money. Because you can produce your art, whatever art form it happens to be, and sell it. But with social media, you can also do videos on producing the art. Now, there's an art in itself to that. But there are loads of people who on YouTube make either a living or even just a supplementary income from if they do lots of art. You know, I mean, whether it be cooking or drawing or painting or whatever it happens to be, or sculpture, by doing videos that are very watchable and just putting them online. So you can actually do, videos of your process and put them online. If you do enough, you can actually, I used to for YouTube for me used to be a supplementary income. When I did my gaming channel, it was never going to be, and I never wanted it to be enough to like have a career switch. I wouldn't have wanted to do that for a gaming channel. But when I say about, real terms pay cuts for teachers at a time, from about 2015, which is when I started monetizing YouTube, I'd been doing it for a bit before, but 2015 is when I started monetizing it. And 2016 is when I started making money on it. I didn't make money to begin with. I used to joke to my colleagues that I was the only one getting a pay rise around here. Because I was actually getting, with my YouTube income, effectively above inflation pay increase. I was the only one who was winning in the college compared with when Labour were last in. Why was NIMBYism not an issue in the past when Tories used to build lots of homes under Macmillan? I suppose when you're going that far back, there was such an urgent need for housing, such an urgent need that the NIMBYism didn't really exist. or if, I mean, you're talking before my time, so I can't speak from personal experience, and I'm not a historian, but I would imagine, you know, the number of homes built at that time would have been such that, yeah, and also, if you think about going back that long anyway, the Conservative Party back then was fundamentally different to the one now, just like the Republican Party back then in America was very, very different to the Republican Party now. The Republican Party back then used to tax the rich. The taxes on the rich by, you know, from Republican governments in America were eye-watering compared to today. You know, you look in France at the moment, and the far left want to introduce massive levels of income tax, like ridiculous levels of income tax to people above a certain level of income. It's not even that much. It's like a few €100,000 a year, I think. And it's quite funny because I saw a few people say, oh, France are going to tax the rich this much. And I was saying, no, they're not. A group that is the largest bloc in the French Parliament now, but is still a minority, wants to do it. There's no way they're going to get support for it. And yet, in America, like back in the 1950s, 1960s, that was not unusual. Those rates of income tax, they might have applied at a higher threshold in real terms, but those rates of income tax, like well above 50%, the Republicans used to apply those. They're fundamentally different. Both the Conservatives and the Republicans are fundamentally different parties to where they were half a century or more ago. But anyway. Power to people saying, Kay's cooking. I'm not familiar with that. Kay's cooking Sprinter Man. Nobody's making those recipes, but she's fun to watch. It reminds me of, but that's the thing. With art videos, like there's a lot of cooking. So there's different types of cooking channel. I like cooking, so I like watching cooking channels. I'm not familiar with that one. But there are there's three main types, I suppose. The first type of things like, you know, the Google Foods thing, where it's like a scientific approach to it, which I really love. But then you've got your instructional cooking videos. Like, what my favorite is Food Wishes, is American guy, he's brilliant. And he's showing you how to make something, right? But then you've got the other ones where there's no talking. There's a recipe of sorts, and there's the odd little comment, but there's no talking. It's just them showing you the thing. And you have got a recipe, so you can still follow it. And it's just set to music. So it's just eye candy. You know, it's eye candy. And the thing is, they're brilliant. People will just watch those over and over again. And you can do the same thing with any art. It doesn't have to be instructional. It's just something to watch. People will enjoy watching it, and they'll watch it, and they'll watch another, and they'll watch another. And something like that's not even that competitive, because the more creators do it, the more likely people are to watch it, because there's more stuff to watch. You just have to make it so that it's very watchable. So the skill there is not only being good enough at the art and, spend enough time on the art to have enough content, but also then there is the extra artistic side of it, of turning it into a video that people will just want to watch for pleasure, without actually wanting to reproduce the art. Most people watching a cooking program don't want to cook. Most people watching a cooking program are sat there eating a pot noodle. They just want to watch it. They want to, oh yeah, I would totally make that, only I don't have the right knife. Never mind. But anyway. How much permanent damage do I think the Tories have done to the Conservative brand with younger generations? I'm Generation Z, just missed the referendum, never voting Tory. So, permanent, obviously, I mean, as Labour have shown over the last few years, in theory, there is no such thing as permanent damage, because it's the people in charge of the party. However, what I would say is the Conservatives have to understand, first of all, they've hurt people a great deal in terms of the cost of living crisis and in terms of public trust issues over things like Partygate and the absolute landslide of scandals we've had. I mean, it's there are going to be Labour scandals. Let's make no bones about it. There are going to be scandals over this Parliament. There's not going to be anything like... You'll be able to count them on the fingers on one hand. And I mean, like, when I say scandals, I mean, like, people getting caught being corrupt or something like that. And as long as Labour deal with it, they shouldn't suffer too much. You'll always suffer some reputational loss which is why you should make sure you try not to don't put corrupt people in charge of a party, but there'll be way fewer, and it'll probably be a couple of years before we get any. So they have lost that. But then there's other things as well where they continue to lose trust. They're still not acknowledging that they've betrayed net zero. So they're still, it doesn't matter what they say, they're still clearly, the climate emergency is very obviously seen as between literally the survival of the human race and fossil fuel corporate interests. And the Tories are very clearly on the side of fossil fuel corporate interests. At that point, the likes of Generation Z are, until the Conservatives really clearly starts to articulate that they understand the climate emergency, they will have lost so many of those younger voters. Then there's their anti-woke agenda. Yes, there are some Tories who are going, this is absolute bollocks, can we stop it, please? But until they can stand up and say, we were wrong to attack these people, you are still going to lose not just those people you were attacking. I mean, they were even attacking the National Trust, for goodness sake. It was, had they attacked the Women's Institute, because that's the ultimate, isn't it? They were attacking the RNLI, the National Trust, lawyers, the RSPB. They had it in for, who the hell has it in for the RSPB, for goodness sake? So they've actually attacked normal Middle England, middle class people. So obviously they're going to have to not just stop doing that, they're going to have to acknowledge we were wrong to do that. And they're not showing any signs of doing that. They're still banging on about leaving the European Convention on Human Rights. All of these sort of things. So it's not just about the damage they did in government. They're still banging on about the same bollocks that put a lot of these younger voters off. And there's a counterpoint as well, because remember, Gerdit, you've asked that question. I did click that one. I will come to that just at the end. There's, a lot of, as we can see in this election, a lot of people do vote, and they are prepared to vote tactically. And they generally do anyway, most people, because they pragmatically understand it's a choice between who can form the government. It's only when there's talk of a hung parliament, kingmakers come into play. So it's essentially at the moment, in terms of our electoral system at the moment, Labour and the Conservatives. And it's making it easier for Labour because Keir Starmer comes out and makes a big show of, we are going to be a country that respects the rule of law again. And so far, he has been true to his word on all of those points. And because he's not only trying to make that point to people in this country, he is actually trying to build bridges with other countries across the world. And quite frankly, the UK has behaved like a bunch of pirates over the last decade or so. Some would argue for long. We were literal pirates at the beginning of the story of the UK. But, there was a time where we were seen as advancing the cause of the rule of law globally. We were instrumental in the setting up of things like the International Criminal Court, Nuremberg trials, European Convention on Human Rights. So we were seen as being a driving force to establish an international rule of law. And recently, it's not entirely down to the Conservatives, but largely it is. Recently, we have not been seen in the same light. So, but by talking about leaving the European Convention on Human Rights, it just makes it easy for Labour, because they just say, well, we're never going to do that. And then on climate emergency as well, again, it's not just that the Conservatives are completely out of whack with these voters on what are seen as top issues. Because you think about the climate emergency and you look at the overall, how important it is to people. It looks like, it's about 20% of people think it's a top issue. But if you drill down to the younger age groups, it becomes a more and more important issue, because there's more of, because these are the people who are more likely to see it all go completely tits up. And you just make it so that they're making a rod for their own back and making it easier for Labour by comparison. But anyway, I'll just do this last one from Gerdit. It's because he put it at the beginning as well. What are your thoughts on the Byline Times article on how Labour failed to deny that Starmer made a secret deal with News UK not to complete the Leveson inquiry? So I'd say a couple of things. First of all, in terms of completing the Leveson inquiry, it should be updated anyway. We shouldn't actually complete the 11th inquiry. We should have a completely new one. And the reason I say that, even if we'd implemented the recommendations at the start, things have moved on now. Like newspapers, for example, have much smaller circulations. However, those same newspapers are still about because most people are consuming their content online. In fact, when I discussed this very point with Graham on his agenda program on Friday, he did actually say the Daily Mail online is the most viewed online news website. I think he said in the world. But that has changed things. So you need, even if we'd had Leveson properly implemented, I would be wanting a review now anyway to take account of the very different way people consume the news. But in terms of press reform, which is what this really about, I found that Byline Times article confusing because they're trying to allude to a secret deal with Murdoch's group, right? And yet, very famously, Starmer, because this was reported before the election, the Times, Starmer met with the editor of the Times, who tried to get him to confirm there would be no press reforms this Parliament. Starmer refused to give him that assurance, and that is why the Times did not endorse him. So actually, Starmer has not been endorsed. It's not just the Times either. Starmer has not received an endorsement from Murdoch. Now, if Starmer's done a secret deal with the Murdoch press, why didn't he get their endorsements? And if you're trying to go and say to me, well, what about the Sun, Phil? The Sun did what the Sun always does. It wants to be seen to back the winner, so it tries to pretend it's influential, but it did not back Starmer. The Sun's endorsement, if that's what you want to call it, was a front page with a picture of a football pitch and a picture of Gareth Southgate, because at the time it was like calls for him to resign. He has since resigned. And it said, it's time... At the time, the England team were still winning, right? But the headline was, it's time for a change of management, and we don't mean the football. So it was supposed to be a tongue-in-cheek, we're sort of think that Labour should have a crack now. But they couldn't bring themselves to say it. It was the most mealy-mouthed endorsement you've ever seen. There was no endorsement from the other papers, not the Murdoch papers. So Starmer didn't get an endorsement. So the idea he's done some secret deal with them seems batshit to me. That is not me saying I think we're definitely going to get press reform, but I do think it's not unlikely. I agree that it's not going to be top priority right now. He's got loads of things to do. And it will be a lot easier because think what happened. As Director of Public Prosecutions, he tried to do what he could as a prosecutor after the phone hacking scandal. Well, something like this becomes a lot easier to deal with if there's another scandal, and people think there may be other scandals. Like, Harry and Hugh Grant, people like that are still really trying to push, to expose a lot of stuff. Maybe if in a couple of years' time, we end up with a Post Office Horizon level scandal with the press again, Labour have put in place a lot of what they want to get done, because they're front loading all the stuff that will take several years to see the benefits. And no one's going to win the election because the government got tough with the press. It's not a vote winner as such. The benefit of press reform is trying to reduce the chances of the press basically hoodwinking the public. But I wouldn't even start with press reform. I would do it in 3 stages, media reform in general. First of all, I would acknowledge there is some decent regulation for broadcast media, but it's not been properly enforced. So I would first of all beef up Ofcom, get Ofcom to do their job properly and rigorously enforce the regulations that already exist. Because if you're going to have any decent press reform, it has got to, because at the moment the press regulate themselves, which is ridiculous. There needs to be an independent, a properly independent press regulator. And in order to get that right, practice on broadcast media first, which is mostly more responsible. So get Ofcom fit for purpose. Once you know you can do that, then press reform. Learn your lessons from like getting Ofcom in decent order. Launch an inquiry, get those recommendations implemented, get a proper independent regulator to hold them to account. And you can move on from there. because we're not going to change the media landscape overnight. Anyway, there'll be too much of a fight. It's not a fight worth having too quickly, so you just need to do bit by bit anyway. But I would start with Ofcom. Get Ofcom to do their jobs properly. But anyway, we're sort of run out of time there. We'll leave it there. I have posted a link to this IFS study, which I had another thing there, by the way, but never mind. The IFS report, it's not a huge report. It's worth reading if you're interested in public sector pay. It's in the description below if you did want to read it. And that's where all of these tables and charts come from, as well as a few others of interest. But thanks very much for coming on, everyone. Have a good rest of evening. I've got to go and feed the kitty cats now because I've been left on my own. And until next time, I'll see you later.